The old farmhouse creaked in the wind, a familiar, unsettling sound that had been the soundtrack to Sarah's life for the past 6 months. She'd inherited the place from her estranged grandmother, a woman spoken of in hushed tones and fearful whispers by the few remaining townsfolk. It was a fixer-upper to say the least, but Sarah, a freelance graphic designer craving a change of pace and a cheaper cost of living, saw potential. The locals warned her about the history of the house, about the tragedies that had befallen its previous occupants. But Sarah, a staunch skeptic, dismissed their tales as rural folklore. Her first few weeks were uneventful, filled with unpacking, scrubbing, and the occasional odd draft. Then came the whispers. Faint at first, like mice skittering in the walls, they'd grow in intensity, seeming to emanate from the empty upstairs bedrooms. She'd blame the wind, the old plumbing, anything but what her gut was screaming at her. One evening, while sketching in her makeshift studio, a chilling cold permeated the room, and the scent of lavender, her grandmother's signature perfume, filled the air. A shadow flickered in her peripheral vision, too quick to be real, too distinct to be ignored. The occurrences escalated, doors creaking open and shut on their own, objects moving from their places, and the persistent feeling of being watched. Sarah's skepticism began to erode, replaced by a gnawing fear. She started researching the house's past, digging through dusty town archives and old newspaper clippings. She uncovered the tragic story of Eliza, her grandmother's sister, who had vanished from the house a century ago, her disappearance never solved. Rumors of a violent argument, a jealous lover, and a hasty burial on the property circulated. Sarah realized the whispers, the cold spots, the scent of lavender. They were Eliza. Eliza wasn't just a story, she was a presence, and she was trying to tell her something. Driven by a mixture of fear and an undeniable curiosity, Sarah delved deeper into Eliza's story, piecing together fragments of local gossip and her grandmother's cryptic journal entries. Eliza, it seemed, had been a vibrant young woman, deeply in love with a man her family disapproved of. The journals hinted at a desperate plea, a secret meeting gone terribly wrong, and an overwhelming sense of betrayal. Sarah began to notice specific patterns in the ghostly manifestations. The whispers would often coalesce into what sounded like frantic pleas. The cold spots would concentrate around a particular section of the attic floor, and the lavender scent would be strongest when Sarah was examining old photographs of Eliza. One stormy night, the activity reached a fever pitch. The whispers became a cacophony, the air crackled with an unnatural energy, and the lavender scent was almost suffocating. Sarah, armed with a flashlight and a pounding heart, followed the strongest emanations to the attic. The floorboards there felt unusually loose. Driven by an instinct she couldn't explain, Sarah began to pry them up. Beneath the warped wood, she found a small, locked wooden box. The chill in the room intensified, and a spectral figure, shimmering and translucent, began to form before her. The faint outline of a young woman, her eyes wide with a centuries-old sorrow. With trembling hands, Sarah managed to pry open the box. Inside, she found a tarnished silver locket containing a miniature portrait of a handsome young man and a bundle of faded letters. As she read them, Eliza's story unfolded in agonizing detail. A secret elopement plan, a heartbroken lover's confession of his own cowardice, and the chilling realization that Eliza's family, fearing scandal, had silenced her permanently and buried her on the property, making it appear as though she'd simply run away. The spectral figure of Eliza reached out, her ethereal fingers brushing against Sarah's as she held the locket. In that touch, Sarah felt a profound sense of release. A centuries-long burden finally lifted. The whispers ceased, the cold dissipated, and the scent of lavender for the first time felt peaceful. Eliza had found her voice, and Sarah had brought her story to light. Sarah carefully reburied the box, now a testament to Eliza's silenced life and Sarah's discovery. The house, once a source of dread, settled into a profound quiet. The whispers were gone, replaced by the gentle creaks of an old house settling. The oppressive cold lifted, and the scent of lavender, when it occasionally wafted through a room, was no longer an omen but a sweet, melancholic memory. Sarah, no longer a skeptic, understood that the past wasn't always buried, but sometimes waited patiently to be heard. She decided to stay, not just to renovate the farmhouse, but to honor Eliza's memory, perhaps by creating a small garden on the spot where she was found, a place of peace for a soul that had finally found its rest. She began incorporating Eliza's story into the renovations, painting a mural of wildflowers in the attic room, and framing a print of the man in the locket for the living room. The townsfolk noticed the change, the subtle shift in the atmosphere of the old farmhouse. They still spoke of its history, but the fear had been replaced by a quiet reverence. Sarah, once an outsider, became a keeper of the house's story, a bridge between the living and the lingering echoes of the past. She learned that some ghosts don't haunt to scare, but to be remembered, their stories woven into the very fabric of the places they once called home. Sarah continued to live in the farmhouse, her initial fear gradually giving way to a deep sense of peace and purpose. She never saw Eliza's apparition again, but she felt her presence as a gentle, watchful spirit, a quiet guardian of the home. The renovations progressed, transforming the neglected farmhouse into a comfortable and inviting space. Sarah often found herself talking to Eliza, sharing her day, her thoughts, and her dreams, feeling an unspoken companionship. She discovered that Eliza's story had resonated with her on a profound level, awakening a latent empathy and a newfound appreciation for the unseen currents that connect us to those who came before. Word of Sarah's experience and her respectful approach to the house's history began to spread. People from neighboring towns, intrigued by the story of the ghost and the woman who had given her peace, started to visit, not out of morbid curiosity, but out of a desire to understand. Sarah, once hesitant to share, found herself recounting Eliza's story, her voice steady and filled with a quiet conviction. She wasn't just telling a ghost story, she was sharing a tale of love, loss, and the enduring power of remembrance. The old farmhouse, once a place of spectral unrest, had become a beacon of quiet reconciliation, a testament to the fact that sometimes the most profound hauntings are those that lead to healing. Sarah's life settled into a rhythm that blended the mundane with the extraordinary. She continued her freelance design work from the sunny upstairs studio, the very room where Eliza's presence had first made itself known. The house, now meticulously restored, felt alive, not with the chilling energy of a haunting, but with a warmth that seemed to emanate from its very foundations. She'd often leave a small bouquet of lavender on the attic floor, a silent acknowledgement of Eliza's enduring spirit and the peace they had found together. The locals, who once avoided the farmhouse like the plague, now often waved to Sarah as she tended her burgeoning garden, a vibrant splash of color against the weathered wood of the house. The story of Eliza and Sarah had become a local legend, whispered not with fear, but with a sense of hopeful melancholy. Tourists occasionally sought out the farmhouse, drawn by the tale of the empathetic designer who had appeased a restless spirit. Sarah, while not seeking fame, would politely share what she knew, emphasizing the importance of listening to the past and offering solace. She believed that Eliza, in her own way, had wanted her story told. And by doing so, Sarah had not only freed a spirit, but had also found a profound sense of belonging and purpose in the quiet, creaking halls of the old farmhouse. It was a home now, not just for her, but for the echo of a life finally understood.
Peace did not break all at once. It frayed. It began subtly, too subtly for Sarah to name it fear. The lavender in the attic garden bloomed out of season, its scent sharp and overwhelming, no longer soft or nostalgic. The house, once quietly attentive, seemed restless again. Floorboards groaned where no one walked. Doors hesitated before closing, as if reconsidering. At night, Sarah sometimes woke with the certainty that someone was standing just beyond her bedroom door listening. She told herself this was imagination, the residue of living too long with old stories. But then the dreams began. In them, Sarah wasn't herself. She was Eliza, breathless, running through the farmhouse halls as lantern light flickered behind her. Voices shouted her name, not in concern but in command. Every dream ended the same way, hands grabbing her wrists, the sudden pressure of the attic floor against her cheek, and a voice whispering, "Be still. This is for the good of the family." Sarah woke each time with bruises blooming faintly along her arms, fingerprints that faded by morning but never entirely disappeared. Determined to understand what was happening, Sarah returned to the archives, this time looking beyond Eliza. What she found unsettled her far more than the ghost ever had. There were other names, women who had lived in the farmhouse across generations, women who vanished quietly, women remembered only in margins, their deaths attributed to illness, misadventure, or silence. And always, the same family members remained, prosperous, respected, untouched. Sarah realized with growing dread that Eliza had not been unique. She had merely been the loudest echo. The house wasn't haunted by one spirit. It was layered with them, bound together by secrecy and blood. Eliza hadn't been asking only to be remembered. She had been warning her. That night, the whispers returned. Not frantic this time, but coordinated, overlapping, filling the walls like a gathering storm. The lavender scent turned acrid, almost rotten. Shadows pooled in corners, stretching upward into shapes that resembled women standing shoulder to shoulder, their faces indistinct but their grief unmistakable. And at the center of it all, Eliza appeared, not sorrowful but furious. "You let them rest," Eliza's voice echoed. No longer a whisper, but a chorus threaded with others. But the house remembers everything. The floor beneath Sarah's feet trembled. Cracks spidered across the attic boards, revealing dark earth below, too shallow, too close. Sarah understood then that peace had only been possible while the truth remained partial. By telling Eliza's story alone, she had disturbed something deeper, older, angrier. The house did not want reconciliation. It wanted reckoning. Walls bled moisture, windows rattled violently. The door at the top of the attic stairs slammed shut, sealing Sarah inside as the spectral figures closed in, their outlines sharpening, faces twisted not into monsters, but into expressions of accusation. "Tell all of it," they demanded, "or join us." Sarah survived the night, though she never fully remembered how. The townspeople found her at dawn, barefoot in the field, clutching the silver locket and screaming about bones beneath the floor. Excavations followed, then arrests, then headlines that shattered the town's long-held reverence for certain family names. The farmhouse was emptied after that. No one would buy it. No one would enter it after sunset. Sarah left town soon after, carrying the full story with her. Every name, every silenced life. She published it without softening a single truth. The book was not popular, but it was necessary. Sometimes, far from the farmhouse, Sarah still smelled lavender on the air. But now it carried no comfort. It was a reminder. Some ghosts want peace, others want justice. And some houses will never stop whispering until every buried truth has been unearthed. Sarah thought distance would dull the echoes. It didn't. She moved 3 states away, into a modern apartment with clean lines, silent walls and neighbors she barely knew. There were no creaks, no drafts, no attics heavy with memory. Yet some nights, just as sleep took hold, she heard it, the faint groan of old wood bending under unseen weight. Not around her, but inside her, as if the farmhouse had learned the shape of her thoughts and followed her there. The lavender came back first. Not a scent this time, but a taste, bitter, metallic, lingering at the back of her tongue when she woke from dreams she couldn't fully recall. She began to find dirt beneath her fingernails in the mornings, dark and compacted, as though she'd been digging in her sleep. Once she woke standing in her kitchen, hands pressed flat against the wall, whispering names she didn't recognize, but somehow knew were important. She stopped sleeping alone. The book should have ended it. That's what Sarah believed. Truth exposed. Justice served. Bones returned to light, but the letters started arriving soon after. Publication, unmarked envelopes filled with brittle scraps of paper, torn from journals she had never seen in the archives. The handwriting was different in each one, yet the words shared the same rhythm. He said it would be quick. They told me to stop screaming. I thought she would help me. And always the final line, "The house chose you." Sarah tried to trace the letters. No postmarks, no fingerprints. She burned the first few, but the ashes clung together unnaturally, forming dark, petal-like shapes that smelled faintly of lavender. She stopped destroying them after that, stacking them carefully in a box beneath her bed, because something in her understood that forgetting had never been an option. The dreams changed. She no longer was Eliza. She was herself now, standing in the attic while the women watched. They no longer accused. They waited. Beneath the floorboards, the earth pulsed slowly like a living thing, and Sarah felt a pull, not violent, not urgent, but inevitable. In the dreams, Eliza stood apart from the others, her expression hollowed by something like regret. "We didn't know," she said once. "What it would cost you." "Cost me what?" Sarah asked. Eliza only looked toward the floor. The call came on a grey morning, years after Sarah had sworn never to return. A developer had purchased the land. The farmhouse was scheduled for demolition. Sarah felt it then, sharp, immediate terror. Unlike anything she had known before, the house wasn't angry. It was afraid. That night the whispers came in full, pouring through her apartment walls. Her phone buzzing with messages from unknown numbers filled with dates, coordinates, shallow depths. The women were no longer bound to the farmhouse alone. By speaking for them, Sarah had become an extension of the place that had held them, a keeper, a vessel. When Sarah returned, the farmhouse was already fenced off, its windows dark, its silhouette warped against the sky. The air around it vibrated faintly, like pressure before a storm. As she crossed the threshold for the last time, the door slammed shut behind her, not in threat, but in relief. The attic floor had been torn open. Below it, not graves, but layers, decades of careful concealment, of ritualized silence. The house had not simply witnessed the violence. It had been shaped by it, fed by it, taught to hold what the world refused to carry. And now, with destruction imminent, it needed somewhere else to put it all. Sarah understood too late. They never found her body. The farmhouse collapsed during demolition, the ground beneath it sinking inward as if hollowed out. Officials blamed poor foundations, unstable soil. The site was sealed, forgotten. But sometimes in other towns, in other houses with bad histories and quiet rooms, people smell lavender where no flowers grow. They hear floorboards creak in places that shouldn't exist. They dream of a woman standing patiently in the corner, listening, waiting, because houses can be torn down, stories can be buried again. But what has been asked to remember, what has been chosen, never truly lets go. The first sighting came 6 months after the demolition. A woman matching Sarah's description was seen standing at the edge of a construction site 2 towns over, where an old boarding house was being renovated. She wore mud-stained boots and carried a faint scent of lavender that lingered long after she vanished. When questioned, the workers disagreed on her face. Some said she looked young, others impossibly tired, but all remembered the same thing. She had been listening, head slightly tilted, as though the walls themselves were speaking to her. That night, the boarding house revealed a crawl space no one had known existed. Stories like that began to surface quietly, stitched together through rumor rather than headlines. A condemned orphanage, where shallow graves were uncovered after a woman was seen walking its halls after dark. A private residence where a family fled overnight, claiming the house. Wouldn't stop showing her things. Each place shared a common detail. A woman appeared shortly before the truth came out, and disappeared once it could no longer be denied. Some began to call her the listener. No photographs ever came out clearly. Security footage glitched, phone recordings filled with static when she spoke. But survivors, those who had lived atop secrets and survived their uncovering, spoke of her voice with unease. It wasn't threatening, it was patient. And it always asked the same question: who was forgotten here? Sarah did not experience time the way she once had. Memories slipped out of order. Sometimes she felt centuries old, her body heavy with borrowed grief. Other times she felt newly made, hollowed out and refilled by the murmurs of places that had learned to keep quiet. She understood now that the farmhouse hadn't claimed her out of malice. It had prepared her. Eliza appeared only once more, not as a ghost, but as a reflection in a darkened window. "We wanted rest," Eliza said softly, "but you gave us voice. That changes things." Sarah searched the glass for her own face and didn't recognize it anymore. There were rules, unspoken but absolute. Sarah could not intervene directly. She could not accuse, threaten, or expose on her own. She could only listen, guide, and endure the weight until others chose to act. If she stayed too long in one place, the house would begin to anchor her, pulling her into walls, floors, foundations. More than once she felt herself thinning, her edges blurring, as if she might be absorbed entirely. Lavender marked those moments. When the scent grew too strong, she knew it was time to leave, or risk becoming part of the structure. Another silent layer pressed into wood and stone. Years passed, then decades. Houses changed, towns forgot, but patterns remained. Wherever violence had been hidden with care, wherever silence had been inherited like property, Sarah would eventually arrive. Not summoned by chance, but by pressure, the unbearable weight of what a place had been forced to hold. She no longer feared this existence. What frightened her was the thought of what would happen if she ever stopped listening, because some night, in some ordinary home, a new family would move in, unaware of the hands beneath their floors, the names sealed into their walls, and without someone to hear them, the houses would remember on their own, and they would not be gentle. The house that nearly broke her was still standing. It sat at the end of a narrow road choked with weeds, its windows boarded, its roof sagging inward like a bowed spine. No one remembered exactly when it had been abandoned, only that families never stayed long. Children grew sick. Adults argued violently, then left in the night. The town called it cursed, but no one could say why. The lavender hit Sarah before she reached the porch. Not blooming, burning. This place hadn't been waiting. It had been screaming. Inside, the air was thick and wet, every surface stained as if the walls themselves sweated fear. The floorboards dipped unnaturally, and the ceiling beams were carved with notches, tally marks. Hundreds of them, some shallow, some gouged so deep they split the wood. This wasn't a house that hid a single crime. It was a house that had been used. Sarah stepped forward and the whispers surged instantly, far louder than anything she'd heard before. They weren't fragmented memories, they were synchronized, disciplined, trained into silence and obedience. "Don't make noise. Don't look up. It will be worse if you tell." Her knees buckled. The women here did not appear as individuals. They moved as a mass. Shadows peeled away from the walls, merging into a shape that was almost architectural. Too many arms, too many mouths. Faces pressed together as if the house itself had learned how to mimic them. When they spoke, it felt less like sound and more like pressure behind Sarah's eyes. "You are late," they said. Sarah tasted blood. "I came as soon as I could," she whispered, though she didn't know why she was apologizing. The floor beneath her cracked open, not to reveal graves, but a staircase descending into darkness. The basement was still warm. Chains hung from the ceiling, their links polished smooth by years of contact. The walls were lined with names scratched repeatedly, some overwritten so many times they became illegible. In the center of the room stood a chair bolted to the floor, its arms scarred with bite marks. This wasn't memory. This was preservation. The first time Sarah failed to hear the call, the consequences were immediate. It happened in a newly built subdivision. Identical homes, smooth drywall, freshly poured foundations. No history, no age, no whispers. Or so everyone believed. Sarah passed through the town without stopping, the lavender absent, the air clean and empty. 3 weeks later, the news broke. A sinkhole opened beneath one of the houses, swallowing the living room whole. Beneath, it were bones, dozens of them, mixed with rusted tools and fragments of restraints. The land had once been a private reform camp. Erased, repurposed, built over without ceremony. Sarah felt it then, a violent wrench in her chest, as though something had torn free. The houses no longer needed her to arrive first. That night, the dreams turned hostile. She stood in an endless corridor of doors, each marked with an address she recognized, or would someday. Behind every door, something pounded to be heard. The sound was deafening, chaotic, unfiltered, and above it all, a new presence moved. Not Eliza, not the women. Something vast and formless, stitched together from accumulated silence. It did not whisper. It roared, a vibration that bent the corridor, split the doors and drove Sarah to her knees. You taught them to speak, it said. Now they do not need you. Lavender burned her lungs. When Sarah woke, she couldn't move. The room around her, an anonymous motel, felt wrong. Dimensions subtly skewed, corners stretching too far. The walls pulsed slowly in and out, like breathing flesh. She realized with mounting terror that she was inside something that was not a house, but becoming one. The listener was being replaced. The role was evolving. Eliza came to her one last time. She looked afraid. We opened the doors, Eliza said. But now the silence has learned how to walk without us. It doesn't want truth. It wants habitation. Then what am I for? Sarah asked, her voice barely audible. Eliza touched her forehead, and the lavender receded for the first time in years. Choice. Sarah disappeared the next morning.
No sightings. No lavender. No woman listening at the edges of broken places. For a while, things grew worse. Buildings collapsed. Secrets surfaced violently, without context or care. Innocents were crushed by revelations that came too fast, too raw. Then slowly, something shifted. Houses began to feel lighter. Some say Sarah learned to do what no house ever could. Instead of listening for the past, she learned to listen for the future, intervening before silence had time to settle. Before violence could fossilize into foundations and beams. Others say she became something else entirely, dispersed, unbound. Woven into moments of hesitation and mercy, all anyone knows for certain is this. Every now and then, someone stands in a room and decides to speak. They don't know why. They only know they can't stay quiet anymore. And somewhere, faint as memory, there is no scent of lavender at a lonely the sudden. Terrifying freedom of being heard, the freedom did not last. Silence. Once broken, does not disappear, it retreats. Watches, learns. It began to adapt in subtler ways. No more sinkholes. No collapsing houses. No dramatic revelations that forced the truth into daylight. Instead, there were renovations. Cover stories. Healing spaces built atop old wounds, complete with plaques that spoke vaguely of difficult histories without naming a single victim. The houses learned how to apologize without confessing. And somewhere in that careful, curated forgetting, Sir stirred. She became aware again inside a place without walls. It was a threshold and in-between space that smelled faintly of dust and rain. She felt stretched thin, her consciousness braided through moments rather than locations. She could sense when someone hesitated before lying, when a hand paused before locking a door, when a child opened their mouth to speak and was silenced by a look. Those moments tugged at her. She followed one. The house was ordinary. Too ordinary. A suburban rental, freshly painted, staged for new tenants. No lavender, no whispers. But the air vibrated with restraint, the kind that comes from practiced calm. A woman stood in the kitchen, staring at the sink. Her knuckles were white, her breathing shallow. Upstairs, something thudded softly once. Twice, then stopped. Sarah did not appear as a woman this time. She appeared as a thought. "You're allowed to open the door?" The woman flinched, gasping, her eyes darting wildly. The thought came again, firmer. "You're not imagining it." When the police arrived, found a locked room behind a false wall. Inside were signs of long-term confinement, sensed, ongoing, meticulously hidden. The headlines called it a miracle. Neighbors said they'd never suspected a thing no one mentioned. Lavender Sarah felt the cost immediately. Part of her unraveled, scattered by the act. She understood then what Eliza had tried to warn her of long ago. Listening had been safer. Intervening required sacrifice, and silence was patient. The counterforce began to move, not in houses, but in people. Individuals who thrived on secrecy felt it first, an unease they couldn't name, a sense of being watched not by ghosts, but by memory itself. They built thicker walls, deeper basements. They spoke of privacy, of overreach, of the danger of digging too deeply into the past. Places of harm became harder to find, not because they were gone, but because they were learning to hide in plain sight. Sarah began to fracture. She could no longer hold every moment. She had to choose where to press, where to whisper, where to let silence collapse under its own weight. Each choice left something behind: memories, sensations, pieces of who she had been. Sometimes she wondered if, in time, she would become nothing more than an impulse, a sudden chill, a hesitation, a dream half remembered, ghost without a house. In one final place, an old farmhouse rebuilt into a retreat center, Sarah felt a familiar pull. The layout echoed another life. The wind through the eaves carried a note she had not heard in years. Lavender Eliza stood there, waiting, not angry, not whole, but enduring. "It's getting harder," Sarah said. Though she had no mouth, Eliza nodded. "It always does, when the truth has to move faster than fear." "What happens when I can't do this anymore?" Eliza smiled sadly. "Then someone else will feel the pause, the doubt. The moment where silence almost wins sand doesn't." The farmhouse exhaled, not haunted, not healed, open. And somewhere far away, in a room that looked safe and clean and new, someone hesitated before saying nothing. That hesitation, that fracture in silence, was enough. For now the hesitation spread, not like a disease, but like a quiet instinct, an almost forgotten reflex returning to the body. People began to pause in moments that once passed unnoticed. A landlord reread a lease clause and felt uneasy. A teacher lingered after class, unsettled by the way a student avoided eye contact. A contractor refused a job after noticing a sealed room that shouldn't have been there. No one could explain why. They only knew. Something felt wrong. Sarah moved through those pauses like a current through water. She no longer guided with words or images. She nudged attention, heightened awareness, the sense that ignoring something would cost more than confronting it. Each nudge weakened her. Each nudge mattered. Silence responded by refining itself. It learned to wear empathy like a mask, to frame concealment as protection, to call exposure cruelty. Sarah felt it coil around language itself, phrases like moving on, respecting privacy, not opening old wounds. Silence stopped barricading doors and began soothing those who might open them. This frightened her more than the screaming houses ever had, because it worked. Sarah nearly missed the place that reminded her who she was. It was a farmhouse against, smaller, newer, rebuilt after a fire. Nothing overtly wrong. No records of violence, no whispers. But when she brushed against it, she felt a hollow where memory should have been, like a scar deliberately smoothed over. Inside lived an elderly woman who spoke gently and forgot often. Too often Sarah lingered at night. The woman wandered the halls, touching the walls as if searching for something just out of reach. Sometimes she cried without knowing why. Sometimes she spoke a name she no longer remembered belonging to anyone. Sarah followed those moments inward, past the forgetting, past the careful erasures of age and time. She found a room the woman never entered anymore, not locked, simply unreachable. The memory came back all at once. A sister, an accident that wasn't. Meant to erase one story and preserve another. The woman collapsed in her chair, gasping, clutching at her chest knot in pain, but in terror at remembering too much. Too late, Sarah hesitated. This was the cost Eliza had warned her about. Truth does not always heal the one who kept it. Sarah chose mercy. She softened the memory, not removing it, but reshaping it into something survivable. Regret without horror. Responsibility without detail. The woman woke the next morning calmer, heavier, but no longer hollow. She called her daughter. She confessed the house felt lighter, Sarah. Felt thinner. That was when silence finally spoke directly to her. Not as a voice, as an offer, rest, release, an end to watching, choosing, unraveling. You have done enough, it promised. Let forgetting finish the work. Sarah felt the temptation keenly, to stop listening, to stop carrying, to finally rest. Eliza appeared not beside her, but within her memory, not as a ghost, as a woman who had once been silenced and refused to stay that way. We never needed you forever, Elisa said, only long enough to remind the world how to hear. Sarah understood then. She was not the listener. She was the interruption. When Sarah finally let go, it was not dramatic. No disappearance. No final act, just a loosening. Her presence dissolved into thousands of small moments. A question asked too soon. A pause held too long. Silence broken before it could harden. The lavender never returned. It wasn't needed anymore. Somewhere, a house still stands that has never been opened. Maybe it will be, maybe it won't. But now, when its walls begin to tighten around a secret, the people inside feel it, a pressure, a discomfort, a sense that keeping quiet is no longer neutral. And that is how the story continues. Not with ghosts, not with houses, but with the terrible, fragile courage of listening before silence learns how to win again. The night the lights went out across 3 counties, Sarah felt it like a hand closing around her throat. Not metaphorically, not gently. Every hesitation she had dissolved into the dark at once. People thought it was a grid failure, a storm that never came. Emergency radios crackled, then fell silent. Phones lit briefly with missed calls, then died mid-ring. Houses new and old alike, filled with a darkness that felt too deliberate. To complete, in that darkness, silence stopped pretending. It did not whisper anymore. It moved. Walls tightened. Ceilings pressed lower. Floors softened underfoot, not collapsing but yielding, as if the houses were remembering how to hold things again. People stood frozen in living rooms and hallways, seized by a certainty they could not explain. Something here does not want me to leave, Sarah. Reassembled herself by instinct alone, not fully, not cleanly. She came together in fragments, reflections, in blackened windows. Pressure behind the eyes, the sudden memory of a name no one had said aloud in years. She had no body, but she had urgency. Silence was reclaiming territory in one house. A man stood in the dark at the top of the basement stairs, listening to something breathing below him. He told himself it was pipes. Always pipes. The excuse tasted familiar. Sarah pressed into his hesitation. Not a word. A feeling. The certainty that if he turned away, he would never be able to claim ignorance again. He went down. The scream cut the dark open. Elsewhere, a woman sat on her bed, clutching her phone like a talisman. The walls around her room flexed subtly, the paint cracking in thin vertical lines like stress fractures in bone. She smelled something sharp and floral. Lavender burned too hot. She whispered, "I didn't know," to no one. Sarah answered without sound. "You know now." That was enough. The woman ran across the darkened counties. This repeated, not cleanly, not heroically. Some people froze. Some lied to themselves until the walls answered for them. Some acted too late. Silence accepted casualties. It always had. The lights came back unevenly, stuttering on like a reluctant admission. Officials spoke carefully the next day. There were investigations. Conflicting reports. Structural failures that made no sense. Rooms that didn't exist on blueprints? No. One used the word haunted, but no one slept well either. Sarah felt herself thinning again, this time. Silence noticed it gathered itself not into a presence, but into patterns. Legal language. Zoning laws. Non-disclosure agreements. Settlements that sealed mouths as effectively as concrete. You can't be everywhere. It reminded her. Sarah didn't argue. She learned to fracture on purpose. She broke herself into moments, sharp enough to cut through paperwork, into instincts that made signatures hesitate. Inspectors looked twice. Buyers asked the wrong question. At the right time, each fragment hurt. Each fragment worked, but fear was changing. People no longer feared ghosts or houses. They feared knowing, feared what they might be forced to do if they couldn't look. A weight silence fed on that fear, growing sleek. Efficient Sarah nearly failed in a hospital wing built over an erased cemetery. She arrived too late. The walls had already learned to absorb screams. She pressed herself into a nurse's exhaustion, into the split second before routine smothered. Instinct. The nurse stopped, looked at the floor, called for a supervisor. The chain reaction was small. It was enough. Sarah felt something. Tear-free, not pain. Permission. She realized then what silence could never understand. Fear doesn't end when the truth comes out. It changes allegiance. Silence had taught houses to hold secrets. Sarah had taught people to feel the cost of holding them that night, the first time in years. Sarah felt no pull toward any place at all. No lavender, no pressure, just stillness. She understood the danger immediately. Stillness meant silence was regrouping, learning, preparing something that wouldn't rely on walls or rooms or even people. Sarah gathered what remained of herself and waited, because the worst hauntings don't begin in old houses. They begin when nothing feels wrong, and everyone agrees to keep it that way. Asterisk. It started with daylight. Perfect. Clean daylight that exposed everything and explained nothing. Windows threw honest shadows. Rooms behaved. Houses stayed still. The world felt briefly, terrifyingly normal. Sarah knew better. Silence had stopped hiding in structures. It had learned to live in agreement, in the nods that ended conversations, in the phrases people used to smooth over discomfort, in the relief that followed, not asking, no walls needed. Sarah felt herself strain against it. Thinner than ever, stretched across a million near misses. She could no longer rely on fear to wake people. Fear had become negotiable, optional, manageable. Silence had matured. The first sign was laughter in the wrong places, jokes told too quickly after bad news, smiles pasted over unease, the social instinct to keep things light, to keep things moving. Sarah pressed into one of those moments, an office break room. Fluorescent lights humming. A man laughed, then stopped. The pause lasted half a second. Long enough he frowned. Looked at the email again. Asked a question no one wanted to answer. Silence recoiled, not loudly, not visibly, but Sarah felt it lose ground. She understood then what she had become. Not a warning. A delay. Silence thrived on speed. And how quickly people moved past discomfort. Sarah slowed things down. She lived in the hitch in someone's breath, the extra second before a decision. The uncomfortable quiet that begged to be filled, and who she was no longer an interruption. She was friction. Silence tried to outpace her. News cycles accelerated. Scandals blurred together. Outrage burned hot and fast, then vanished. People learned to absorb horror without stopping. Sarah nearly tore herself apart trying to hold all those moments. She failed more often now. She felt the losses not as guilt, but as weight. Each missed pause settled somewhere inside her, accumulating like sediment. She wondered how much she could carry. Eliza did not come to her, not because she couldn't anymore. Sarah was beyond ghosts now. The next blackout was smaller, localized, targeted. A single building. It was an archive, not records of records, metadata, indices, cross-references, the map of where truths were stored, buried, redacted, or quietly reclassified. Silence was no longer erasing history. It was reorganizing it. Sarah poured what remained of herself into that building, She became heat in the server room, static in the air. The sudden, irrational dread that made a technician pull the wrong drive at the right moment. Files surfaced. Connections formed, questions followed. Silence did not rage. It adapted. Again, it began to sound reasonable. We can't know everything. Some things do more harm uncovered. At what point does remembering become cruelty? Sarah felt those arguments, cut deeper than any wall ever had, because they weren't lies. She wavered, for the first time since the farmhouse. She hesitated. Silence leaned in. In that hesitation, Sarah felt something else small, fragile, unmistakably human. Someone else pausing, not because of her, because of themselves. A woman closed her laptop instead of deleting a file. A man stopped mid-sentence and corrected himself. A child asked a question that no one answered right away. Sarah felt them not as anchors, but as echoes. She wasn't alone anymore. That was the moment. Silence finally understood its mistake. It had taught the world how to forget Sarah, had taught it how to hesitate. Others were learning, the rest on their own. Silence withdrew, not defeated, not gone. Watching, waiting for speed to return, Sarah loosened her grip, not letting go. Sharing the weight, she did not disappear. She diffused into classrooms and courtrooms and kitchens at midnight, into the space between what is said and what is meant, into the second thought that arrives uninvited and refuses to leave. No, Lavender followed her now, only a pressure behind the eyes, a question that wouldn't settle. Some nights, people wake up uneasy. For no clear reason, they sit in the dark and listen, not for ghosts, for themselves and far away everywhere. At least silence waits, patient as ever, because it knows something. It's important. The fight is no longer about houses, it's about how quickly people move on. And this time, Sarah isn't the only thing slowing them down. The first time someone said no out loud didn't sound heroic. It sounded awkward. The room went quiet in the way rooms do, when everyone feels the shift but no one knows how to name it. Papers rustled. Someone cleared their throat. Silence leaned forward, ready to smooth it over. It didn't get the chance. Sarah felt that moment, like a bell struck underwater, not loud, but carrying. Silence adjusted tactics again. It stopped opposing truth directly and began overwhelming it, instead floods of information without context. Disclosures stacked so tightly they blurred into noise. Everything was revealed, all at once, until nothing felt distinct enough to matter. If everything is shocking, nothing as Sarah nearly vanished there. She couldn't slow a flood. She could only redirect attention, pin it, briefly, to a single detail that refused to dissolve. A name repeated twice. A date that didn't align. A sentence that ended too cleanly. People began circling back. That was new. Silence hated circles in one city. A hearing dragged on far longer than expected. Not because of protests or outrage, but because someone kept asking, "Can we go back to that part?" Sarah stayed in that question. She hollowed herself into it. The cost was steep. She no longer remembered her own face when she tried. It slipped, replaced by impressions instead. Attic dust. Burned lavender. The ache of old floorboards under bare feet. She remembered Elisa clearly, but herself only as motion, a function. Silence noticed. It began to whisper not threats, not bargains but reminders. "You're fading. You could stop. No one would know." Sarah almost agreed. Then someone laughed at the wrong moment again and stopped themselves. That pause felt different this time. Stronger, owned Sarah. Realized something essential. Silence no longer needed her permission to fail. She shifted strategy. Instead of pressing into moments of fear, she leaned into moments of care, the impulse to check in, to follow up, to sit with discomfort instead of resolving it. Silence struggled there. Care took time. A man knocked on a neighbor's door late at night. Uneasy for reasons he couldn't articulate. A woman reread an old message and decided not to delete it. A group stayed after a meeting ended. The chairs still warm, the questions unresolved. Sarah, rested in those leftovers? Silence. Tried to brand this as inefficiency, as weakness, as impractical. It failed because something else had entered the system. Responsibility, not imposed, felt Sarah. Felt herself stabilizing. Not whole, not human, but no longer unraveling. She wasn't carrying everything anymore. The load was distributed, imperfectly but genuinely. She was becoming less necessary, and that was the point. Silence retreated, into long games again. Generational ones. It began planting the idea that exhaustion was inevitable, that vigilance could not last, that caring too much would burn. People out, Sarah watched that seed take root in some places. She watched it fail in others, in one small town. A library stayed open late. No reason given. People came anyway. Sarah felt Eliza then not as a presence, but as a resonance? Not. Speaking, listening, silence didn't like listeners. Any more listeners lingered? The world didn't change all at once. It never does, but it slowed. Just enough. Some secrets stayed buried, some never would. What mattered was that fewer people pretended not to feel the ground shift beneath them. Sarah no longer waited for calls. She drifted into pauses, into second thoughts, into the quiet. After someone says, "That doesn't sit right with me." If she vanished tomorrow, the work would continue. That knowledge steadied. Her silence still exists. It always will. It is old. It is patient. But now, so is hesitation. And hesitation has learned something silence never did. If you stay long enough in the quiet, someone else will speak. Asterisk. The end did not arrive like a confrontation. It arrived like a meeting that ran long. Silence gathered itself one last time, not as a force, not as an enemy, but as a fact. It did not need houses anymore. It did not need laws or darkness or even fear. It only needed people to believe that this was as good as it got. Sarah felt that belief, settling in places she could no longer reach. Wariness, cynicism, the quiet pride of saying, "I already know how this ends." She understood then that she could not win, not in the way stories pretend winning works. So she stopped fighting. Instead, she did the one thing silence could never anticipate. She stayed. Not everywhere, not forever, just long enough. She stayed in the pause after bad news when no one rushed to soften it. She stayed in the silence after a question when no one filled the space. She stayed in the moment someone realized that knowing meant acting and did not look away. Silence pressed close. "You'll fade," it said without malice. "Everything does," Sarah agreed. She let herself thin until she was no longer a presence at all, only a habit, a reflex, the learned discomfort of unanswered questions. She became the instinct to double-check, to ask again, to sit with what hurts instead of burying it neatly. The world did not become just. It did not become kind, but it became harder to lie in. That was enough. One by one, the old signs vanished. No lavender, no pressure, no pull. Sarah did not disappear. She ended, and what remained was smaller, quieter, more dangerous to silence than anything she had ever been. People who paused. Some houses still stand on bad ground. Some secrets still rot beneath polished floors. But now, when the walls tighten, someone notices. They feel it in their chest, in their breath, in the way the room goes wrong. And sometimes they say something, not because a ghost told them to, not because a house demanded it, but because staying silent no longer feels neutral. That is the ending. Not a victory, not a cure, just a world where silence has to work. Hard Ann knows it might not always succeed.